couple of minutes, but I'll do a bit of an introduction for those of you that haven't heard me do this little speech before. So this is the MoJ's very own Sustainability Week, and to raise awareness of the sustainability team, the work we do across our estate and the work we do with our partners. So we've just had a talk from RSPB, and now we're on to the Bat Conservation Trust. We've worked for a long time with the Bat Conservation Trust. We do, Jo's done loads of stuff where she's done training for our staff and offenders in prisons. We've shared information, and now we're working on a bat house prototype to hopefully get built within the prison service. So yeah, I'll hand you over to Jo. So Jo's the Built Environment Manager at the Bat Conservation Trust. She's going to talk to us a bit about bats specifically, and then the effects of artificial lighting on them. So over to you, Jo.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Is that all good? Okay, lovely. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I may have met some of you before. As Bea said, I've been working with the MoJ for a number of years at the Biodiversity Day, giving bat talks and walks, talking to a lot of you guys about bats in general. I'm the Built Environment Manager for the Bat Conservation Trust, so we have a number of work streams that we're working with the MoJ on. One of the key ones for us at the moment, and this is probably not a surprise to many of you, whether you think about it in terms of bats or not, is the of artificial lighting and light pollution and what that is doing. Today I'm going to talk about our bats, but more widely thinking about wildlife and thinking about obviously the impact of human health as well. Now, and this is a big part of what we do, yes, with the Bat Conservation Trust, but what we're really talking about is how can we have bats and people are living alongside each other, you know, in harmony. How can the environment work better for all of us, how that links to our health and well-being. And so really the good thing to remember about bats is they're one of these sort of flagship species, a bioindicator species. So the more that we learn about bats, the more we understand how we can control for impacts on them, the more we can understand about how we can protect our natural environment, and also how we can feel those benefits in terms of our physical and mental well-being. So I'm going to talk about the impacts of artificial lighting, but it really helps to get an idea to start off with on sort of bat ecology and why this is such an issue for them. So I hope you can start to get a feeling for how well bats are adapted to the nocturnal environment if I tell you that their eyesight, they're not blind, but it's similar to our own. So imagine being in the middle of a dark wood, trying to find your food, trying to communicate with the rest of your family, trying to navigate without something beyond our eyesight. They would really struggle. And so all of our bats have this really sophisticated echolocation that allows them to do all of these natural behaviors in complete darkness. This adaptation has allowed them to hunt sort of prey species, insect species, and all of our bats are insectivorous in this country, and outcompete the daytime bird species such as swallows and swifts and house martins. But one of the key things to sort of learn is it's also allowed them to evade predation from our daytime raptor species such as sparrowhawks and things like peregrine falcons. And we do actually see peregrine falcons hunting some of our bat species in lit conditions in our cities. And it helps to realise that not only have they got these fantastic adaptations, but they have had them for a really long time. We are talking about fossil records coming out of Eastern Europe that are recognisable as bat species flying around today from sort of 50 million years ago, 35 million years ago. So when we consider the rate of urbanisation in just the last 50 years, we start to see why this causes our bat species real issues. Now, I talked about predation as being sort of a key for adaptation, and we can start to see why light therefore might be a real issue for them. But it also helps to think of our bat species into two main groups. We have some of our fast flying species and our slow flying species. Now, our fast flying species are species you might have heard of, things like our pipistrelle species, some of our big bat species, but essentially species that we are finding in our cities, species that have been able to adapt to more open, more lit environments because they're faster and they feel that threat of predation less keenly. So unfortunately for our slow flying species, our long-eared, our myotis species, our horseshoe species, they are fantastically well adapted to a completely dark environment, a cluttered environment. They can pick their way through really, really dense woodland in complete darkness. Some of them can even take insect prey off the surface of leaves, or they can take spiders off spider webs. but it does mean that in our more urban lit environments, they really feel that threat of predation. And that's why you tend to have this division between our slow flying and our light shy species, and our fast flying, or what's known as our sort of light opportunistic species. You might hear them called light tolerant species, but that's not really a phrase that we like, because they don't like light per se, but they opportunistically feed it because they around it, because they don't have many other options. And they don't have many other options because, unfortunately, the rate of global light pollution, the rise in that in just the last 20 years has been really stark. So there's been some great mapping work done in 2016, which showed that more than 80% of the world population and 99% of the US and European population live under what is considered to be light polluted skies. And that's 10% higher than normal night brightness. And anybody, whether you're living in your cities or not, I'm sure can appreciate just how bright our skies are, and how things like truly dark night skies have become incredibly squeezed. And there was a really great study done by the campaign to protect rural England just earlier in 2020, where they asked people to go out and look at the constellation of Orion and see how many stars they could count within the sort of the 4 main stars of Orion, and 61% of people are now considered to live within severe light polluted skies in England because they could count less than 10 stars, and that's up from 57% just the year before. So, you know, light pollution is a massive issue for us. It's a massive issue for our bat species. But what kind of impacts are we expecting to see from lighting? Now, I talked about slow and fast flying species, and certainly in the wider landscape, I'll talk in a minute about the differences in the kind of impacts that they can have. But the one place where they are all you know, protected universally, all of our species, is at their roost site, and this relates to their levels of protection as well. So bats are fully protected under national and international legislation, and they're protected against things like disturbance, and they're protected against that at the roost site, so places where it might impact their survival. And lighting is something at the roost site that can actually cause really detrimental impacts to even our fast flying species. So we've known for a long time that lighting at roost entrances, it disturbs bats' natural behaviours. Essentially, as soon as it gets dark, you get that big upswell of insects. Bats want to get straight out and get feeding. The more that they can feed, the more that especially the mothers in the maternity roosts, they can use that to produce milk. They can feed their young, and their babies will grow quicker. And obviously, you can see how this is directly linked to their survival. And so, lighting at roost entrances has shown delayed emergence, but it's also shown things like smaller juvenile growth rates, and the worst case scenario is that mothers will abandon some of these essential roosting sites, these maternity roosting sites, because they fear that sort of risk of predation. So it's an incredibly impactful, and this is why it is actually an offence, and is considered to be an offence against the legislation to have lighting and or to cause entrances to roost sites to be lit. Think about in the wider landscape, again, there's been some really great studies done, you know, for the last sort of 10 years or so, and how bats move through the landscape and what impacts lighting might have on those critical routes. Because again, what bats are trying to do is they're trying to gather this energy from their food, and they're trying to save as much energy as possible to allow themselves to fly and echolocate, these really energy sort of rich activities, and also to feed their young. So basically, just like us, they want to go from A to B as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So they have particular routes through the landscape that allow them to do this, and again relate to how sort of key survival techniques. So lighting, these are some great studies done by Emma Stone at Bristol University. Lighting on these key commuting routes, especially for our slower flying species, was shown to cause a severance essentially of these routes. You bats, slower flying species such as your lesser horseshoes would be seen flying along these commuting routes, hitting these lit areas, and they would essentially form barriers, and the bats would turn around and go back. And it might be that they could get to their feeding route, you know, get to their feeding area via a different route, but that route may be more open to predation. It may take them longer. Whatever it does, it will always be worse than their preferred route, and that has got to have an impact on them in terms of a population level, not just individual bat species. Now, the work was done with traditional high pressure sodium lighting, the stuff that we would have had, 15, 20 years ago. And it was also repeated with newer LED lighting, and slow flying species were impacted each time. Now, it was thought when they originally did the research that effectively some of our faster flying species had got away with it. They were fast enough to nip through these lit areas. They were seen following the hedgerows. And this is where this kind of misnomer came from, that you have, your light shy species, and then some of these, more light opportunistic species that actually were kind of surviving really well in these lit areas. And unfortunately, it was recorded in 2015. There was a really important study done that showed that where you had lighting and you had gaps in the vegetation, it did actually impact the fast flying species. One of our most common urban found species, the common pipistrelle, was recorded to come up against lighting where there were gaps in the vegetation, and this caused a sort of a severance and impact to them, and they didn't move through the urban environment as they would normally. Now, this is a particularly big issue. I'm sure any of us who have been in our cities, and you've got these lovely tree-lined streets, and we talked a little bit earlier about some of the back walks we've done in St James's Park, and you're crossing some of those roads and you see these lovely tree-lined streets and you think, oh, they look perfect for wildlife, but you come back later, you come back at night, and you see that between potentially every single tree there's a light stand. Now, at a certain point, a certain width in the vegetation, that will actually stop bats moving through the urban environment. So it really helps us to look at our urban environment in a different way if we see it at night time compared to seeing it during the day. And we were finding similar responses. This is more recent studies done in Berlin, where some of our faster flying species, our nocturnal bats, large bats, were being tracked through the urban environment. And there were, where there were insects and where there was a food source, they were being found where there was a little bit of light going on, but where, they were favouring dark corridors. They were favouring somewhere that allowed them to move through the landscape where they felt safe. And these are large bats that fly very fast, and they were still recording these kind of impacts. It was also recorded that where you had dense tree cover, this seemed to dampen the negative impacts. And again, these kind of dark areas, these safer areas, were really creating key habitats for this bat species in Berlin. Now, I've talked a little bit about light opportunistic species, and why you might find, bats around lit areas is because of this link between their prey, their insect prey, and light. And for a long time, we've known that UV or blue rich light sources have caused a real impact to our bat species, and this is because it impacts their food. So anything with a very UV or blue rich light source will be really attractant to insects. And so on the face of it, you think, well, this might be great. All of the insect food is in one place for bats, but unfortunately, it creates skewing of the ecosystem. So you will only get particular species of insect that are attracted to lights, and it's estimated by Bug Life that a third of those will die at the light source through exhaustion, through being trapped in the light fitting, some through predation, but it creates a natural balance to the kind of the natural setup of what you would have and how bats would normally hunt. And again, if you've got all of this food at a point light source in the environment, you might have some of the faster flying species that are able to nip in and take advantage of this prey. But those slow flying species will be in dark areas that have essentially had all of that food sucked out of them. So it's a sort of a vacuum effect. You've got these dark, sterile deserts essentially for species that can't leave them to access the light, and then you've got this highly competitive, unnatural setup around lighting. So like I say, we've known for a long time that UV components to light are massively impactful for insects and also for bats. And so little by little, the UV element has been phased out of lighting, and I would say this is a big positive to having LEDs. Some of the older light sources, such as white metal halides, you can see the photo at the top there, and that real blaze of white light, daylight almost, attracting insects and causing this light pollution. These are very much less common now. LEDs are the standard, and one of the good things about LEDs is that you can have them without the blue rich element. You can have what are warmer light sources. And so this got people thinking, well, okay, if UV is so bad and we can move to the warmer end of the spectrum, where does it go from there? Like, can we move to a really warm end of the spectrum? And what does this mean for bats? So studies have been done at roost sites sort of 20 years ago or so, that they were finding were trying to do surveys with red lights, and they were showing less disturbance than some of the white lights. But it wasn't until there was some great work done in the Netherlands 2017, 2018, where they were putting up different coloured light stands along the edge of forest environments, and they were looking to see how does white light compare to green light, compare to red light, compare to the dark control area. And they were getting some really positive results when comparing areas of dark habitat and the red light source. And the red light source you can see there is called the Clearfield. And it's produced by what was Philips, and they're now called Signify. And they've actually been doing a lot of research in this area for a long time, first in the Netherlands, and now, which is really excellent, now over here with us. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Now, it is important to understand that, you know, the work that's done in the Netherlands was great, but we had to see that repetition in the UK, and we had to understand what does that mean for our bat species, because we have a different assemblage. And we were still seeing some red light impact for some of our rarest, slowest flying species. That study done in 2018 was showing that for lesser horseshoes, and there was another study done in Germany into horseshoes, bats, having different coloured light at roost entrances, and still red light was still showing some impact. So it's really important to say that for some species there will be light that has no impact on them. And it's, you know, there's a lot of talk about, you know, bat friendly lighting and things like that, and it's really a term that we will you know, shy away from, because it's important to understand that the best thing for bats is darkness. But it's my job to sit between industry and you know, and understand that in some areas lighting will be essential, but what can we do to protect bats and at the same time ensure that people are happy with light levels in their area. So this is very much a hot topic and ongoing research, and a lot of this research shows that there's a lot of different things at play here. So, for example, you know, I talked a lot just then about foraging habitat and the differences between different coloured lighting. Actually, they looked at the impacts on drinking behaviour, where you had white LEDs. It was showing that even for the faster flying species, it reduced their amount of drinking behaviour, even below the impacts that were found in foraging behaviour. So, as always with bats, still lots to learn. For every question that we answer, there's more that's thrown up. But like I say, because, you know, the impacts on lighting, it's not just about bats, it's about other wildlife. It's not just about other wildlife, it's about people, where, you know, there's a lot of research going on in this area. And so I've talked a little bit at sort of a local level, a roost level, regional level, bats moving through the landscape, but we've even seeing impacts at an international level. And there might be some of you out there who've seen some of these news stories, mainly because you've got a bat of sort of, you know, 7-8 grams in size, that traveling 1,700 kilometers. In fact, the latest news story from last week is one that's traveled 2,200 kilometers. It's been tagged in one area and has followed this migratory route. You can see there's that really clear lines on the map there, and they're moving backwards and forwards. How and why is another question. You know, why are these tiny mammals, why this particular species, Nethusius pipistrelle, really taking these huge journeys? And again, how is lighting affecting them? Well, as they're moving through the landscape, we were seeing impacts from not just the green light, which is you know, one I talked about with a UV component, not just close up, so not just in relation to their insect prey, but actually from a distance, that they are responding positively to it in the environment, aside from their prey species, which was something completely new at the time. This kind of positive phototaxis response, similar we were finding to red light as well. So in relation to you know, foraging and close in the environment, close to their environment, we were seeing red lighting having less of an impact, but actually for migratory species, it's showing more of an impact than warm white lighting. As I say, still lots to learn, and I think this just shows, you know, for each species we have to understand what's going on the site, what, you know, what is good for the site, you know, what habitat is on site that's good for bats, and how we can control for these impacts. And it's all about looking at the previous research, looking at the sites that we have, and looking at some of the best practice guidance. So we've taken this research and we've spoken to other experts, and we've worked with lighting engineers and ecologists with, you know, with this kind of really good amount of knowledge to do with lighting and bats, and produced some best practice guidance. So we've produced European guidance with Eurobats. This is a very high level document. Obviously there's a huge amount of variety in species and legislation and policy across Europe. So the drawdown document from that is Bats and Artificial Lighting in the UK. We published that with the Institution of Lighting Professionals in 2018. And as a follow-up from the ILP, they've actually produced a huge amount of guidance, but there's some really useful guidance that they've produced, which is just in relation to controlling for sky glow, things like their domestic exterior lighting document. And then last year we actually had a bats and artificial lighting symposium. We invited all the experts to come and talk about their case studies, to give examples, to have discussion groups, and there's a document that we produced, a proceedings document, and all of the bat related documents that you see there are freely available from our website, and I will give you the address at the end. And even the 2018 guidance note, I will come back to at the end, but we have already started updating that. That is how much, you know, of a live field this is at the moment. So I'm always interested if anybody out there has used this document or recommended it for feedback, but I will mention that again at the end. So when we're thinking about the impacts at a sort of a broad scale, what can we do about it? You know, thinking about, and this is everything from people in their gardens and their green spaces, all the way through to project managers who might have direct influence over lighting on development schemes. So, you know, the first thing, and the thing that I mentioned before, is, do we need to light? You know, thinking about avoidance as the first port of call. Like, if there's habitat on site that's good for bats, does it need to actually be lit? Can we be cleverer about, for example, where we put things on site? So that's a really key thing. And unfortunately, a lot of the time when we talk about mitigating impacts with developments, people will move over avoidance and start talking about mitigation. But the simplest and quickest and best thing to always do is think, do we actually need to do this in the first place? If we've gone through that process and said, yeah, we need lighting on site, it's important. Okay, well, what kind of lighting can we put on site? Can we be more mindful about the lighting that we use? Can we use lighting, for example, that has no UV content? Does it need to be on all the time? Can you have something that's triggered or is dimmed? Does it need to be across the whole site or in key areas? And because the last, you know, point that you end up is, well, we need to replace habitat that is damaged. So if there is an area where it has to be lit for whatever reason, well, where's the compensation going to come from? And when we talk about compensation, we are talking about how can we replace those dark green corridors that have been lost? That is obviously the most costly and time consuming part of that process. So we always talk to people, you know, at the very start about avoidance. You know, it's about good site layout. It's about being smart about where we place lighting. It's about having discussions with ecologists and people like us about best practice advice and lighting engineers, and being smart at the start of a project to think about whether this needs to be done in the first place. Other things that can be done in terms of mitigation, and I talked about warm white LEDs, trying to get rid of that UV content, thinking about light spill. You can see that light there on the right hand side. There is just light going everywhere. You know, that's not a smart use of light. It's not a good use of energy, of, you know, of costs. All of this kind of stuff is about being better towards the environment and not just bats. So can we be cleverer about how we use light in our environment? And there's a whole range of things that are part of our guidance that we talk about, everything from the type of light fitting that you use all the way down to where does that light fitted, how high is it fitted, where's the light pointing at? And these are just some really nice examples of simple, you know, simple things. You can use the same type of lighting, you can move it into the building a bit, or you can use we work with some great ecologists that have really good ideas about putting in balconies or recessing light fittings, or all of these, you know, clever, simple little, you know, sort of design ideas that allow you to have lighting, but to not let that lighting influence the environment outside. And I'll just cover a couple of the sort of the common pitfalls and things that we see a lot. And the big one is just not getting people this conversation had at the start of a project. You know, you have ecologists and lighting engineers out there, experts that we work with for a reason. Use them. You know, if you have a project where this is something that you think maybe this is an issue or you just don't know, these are the people that you go to. And you read the free guidance on our website and you think about, you know, the less cost things that you can do to a site to make it more friendly for wildlife and protect things like dark skies. And there's a lot more about this in the guidance on the website. I would just say this, the next steps for us really, like I say, this is a very live field. There's a lot going on. We're updating the guidance currently. We've started that process now with our industry contacts. We are helping oversee trials of this red lighting, and part of those trials is also getting feedback from members of the public. They could be potentially controversial. If people don't want to use the lighting, there's no point in us recommending it. So again, gathering all that information in terms of what's good for bats, but what's good for people. So that's a very much watch this space on our website. And we're always collecting and sharing case studies. So if you have sites, you've been to sites, you know, developments where they're doing smart things, where they've got bats, where they've been thinking about how you design lighting properly, or even where you've seen somewhere you think, well, that lighting has been really nicely done to preserve a dark sky, and the wildlife benefits, you know, come second, then again, please always get in contact. I'm always keen to hear about this kind of thing. So that's my contact details there, and I said this to be for any further questions afterwards. There's our website, and you can go in there and type in lighting, and all of the guidance that I talked about and background information is freely available, and I'm happy to answer any questions now that anybody might have.
Brilliant, thank you, Jo. We've just got a couple in. So Rebecca asks, have you worked with local authorities on this, and if so, what sort of response did you get?
So we work with a whole range of people. So we have, I should say, there's a steering group, and it's grown since the last time we did it. So the first few times has been us as the Bat Conservation Trust. We've had lighting engineers, some of which have experience working with local authorities and highways, and we've had ecologists. And one of the ecologists helped write a lighting plan for Bath City, again alongside local planning authorities. Now we have even more ecologists with planning sort of backgrounds, and we're very keen to plug into the local planning authority, because again, if we can't support the local planning authority to make good decisions or give them that information, then that's where things sort of slip through the net a little bit for us. So again, always keen to find out if people have had difficulties with particular areas, and always open to have conversations with people. Excellent.
Carl mentioned that we need to look into installing the right lighting across our whole MoJ estate, like security for prisons, etc.
We have actually produced, it's an overarching document, it's a principles of lighting document. This was a couple of years ago now, a very high level, like I talked about, things to avoid, so avoiding UV lighting and that kind of thing. But the next step is to have the conversation again with the MoJ about specifics, because obviously when we talk about lighting and security, there are other things going on than me saying, well, we need to protect dark areas for bats, and we're very aware of that. So it really helps us having this ongoing conversation with the MoJ, because your requirements are very specific in some areas. So how can we think about which areas do need to be lit, and rightly so, and which areas can be kept dark, and we can have that wildlife people sort of joined up approach.
Yeah. And Rebecca said, can householders set up bat feeders in their garden? Would it be easy or difficult for people to do?
So because bats eat insects, what you really are talking about here is just having a garden that's insect rich. You know, potentially a small water body, but you've got some great range of plants that you can plant that are fantastic for moths and insect species, and you're really looking at encouraging them in that way. There's a great leaflet on our website called Stars of the Night, and we produced it with the Wildlife Trust and the RHS, and it's got some lovely kind of like how to build a bat box that you can put up, how you can build insect bug hotels, and how you can just make your garden richer for bats. And like I said, because they're a kind of an indicator, a keystone species, whatever you do for bats is good for birds, is good for other insects. So I highly recommend you check that out.
Yeah, and I've noticed, so in my garden we've got a hedgerow that goes along the edge, and that's where they really like. So if there is some form of hedge, like reinstating a hedge works really well, because they'll just use it, the linear feature,
like a little highway.
Yeah. Have we got any more? Stephanie I think she just makes a point rather than a question, saying that it's a big problem with householders adding exterior lighting to houses post construction. May or may not have short-term cutout and have a short time cutout, but a range can be like 50 meters plus. So
yeah, agreed. And this is a really difficult topic, because a lot of the stuff I've been talking about is how can we implement this in planning, how can we think about it as part of the development. But once that development is handed over, and I've been to some really excellent sites where they have covenants and things like that, basically like if you buy a house on this development, then these are the type of lightings you're allowed, and that's it. But it is difficult to enforce, and some of it's about education, some of it's about compliance, some of it's about the products that are on the market as well. So we're really keen, once this guidance is updated, to have conversations with manufacturers, because I mean, some of the levels of brightness for security lighting that is on all the time, they're just not needed. And there's a lot of discussions to be had about perceptions of crime and lighting and sharp cutoff points, and what is that actually safer to have a lot of bright lighting when you've got dark areas around you and you can't see what's going on. Well, actually the thinking is that it isn't. So there's some really great advice on, we would never say, never have security lighting, you have to feel unsafe somewhere where you are, but making smart decisions about security lighting, having security lighting that is on at your doorstep, that is on for the amount of time it takes you to take your keys out, let yourself in, close the door. I mean, it's a sensible approach, isn't it? But how you get that, in every development, as opposed to letting people put up some of the stuff themselves. Yeah, it's caused a lot of discussion around the steering group table, and I think it's going to be one of these things that runs and runs. Yeah, definitely.
Michelle just asked, she said, sorry she's joined late, but what's the best type of lighting for reference, please? I'm sure you've already said this, Jo, but it's on your website, isn't it?
For references, for documents. Yeah. Yes, if you go to the Bat Conservation Trust website and you type in lighting or artificial lighting, there's under my section, which is building, planning and development, there's a whole page about lighting. And the 2018 guidance is kind of the industry standard that we produced with the Institution of Lighting Professionals, and that's the one we're updating at the moment.
Excellent. And last one, so city centre lights being left on during lockdown seems ridiculous. Is there any way to get city councils to switch lights off during this time?
It's a funny one, because in rural communities, there's been a lot of discussion about and this is happening. So in rural hamlets and villages and things like that, there's things like overnight lighting being switched off to preserve dark skies. But for some reason, it's almost like in our urban areas, we feel like, oh, it's gone too far. But it's, even if we think, but it's a waste of energy, but it doesn't need to be on. Is it a mindset thing? We need to be thinking about, I mean, we can talk about having darker skies over our urban environment, even if we're never going to have dark skies. And it's fine to start along that road without saying, oh, well, it's never going to be a dark sky, we might as well not do anything about it. So yes, I do agree. And to a certain extent, thinking about how we're smarter with, so that central management systems, having LEDs on systems where there's a central control, so they're dimmed at certain times or they're triggered at certain times, or there's a way for lighting where people want it, but it's just not left on all the time. Yeah, it's about being smarter about what we do. I agree. You do despair sometimes.
Excellent. Right, I think that's it. But thank you very much, Jo. That's been really good, and I hope everyone learnt something and had a bit of a break from their normal work about bats. But yeah, thank you very much for
You're very welcome.
Listening, and cheers, Jo.
You're very welcome.